It's been 6 months since I purchased my Sony A7V, and ever since I purchased it, the 7V has been my main shooter for both photos and videos. The Sony A7V only took kind of a backseat only a month ago when I purchased my Sony A7R6. First impressions that you're gonna find over here, but this video is not about that camera. This video is about the Sony A7V. And the Sony A7V is also the camera that is recording me right now. So you're gonna see the quality throughout the entire duration of the video. So 6 months in, the honeymoon is definitely over. The excitement of the brand new toy is over. And you can be more realistic about what this camera is capable of. And even after 6 months, I was pretty enthusiastic in my first impression video because I mentioned that this camera was, in my opinion, one of the best hybrid cameras you can purchase at below $3,000. 6 months in, I'm even more convinced than that. And in this video, I want to tell you why. This video is not sponsored at all by Sony since I purchased the camera with my own money, but this video is brought to you by K&F with their PL-60B COB 60 watts light, a light that is also serving me as my rim light there on the back, but more on that later. And now back to the camera. In these 6 months, I've shot pretty much anything you can think of, from portrait to products, from wildlife to landscapes, from street photography to candid photography, from my entire YouTube production ever since I purchased the camera has been shot with this Sony A7V to client work here and there. My knowledge of this camera is pretty extensive, and in these 6 months, the most important thing for a professional tool, because yes, the Sony A7V is a professional tool, is that this camera has never failed me once. And when it comes to professional stuff, reliability wins over a spec sheet that may be better in other cameras, that may be more enticing in other cameras. But in this specific case, I think this camera is worth every single penny you spend on it because it gets you a lot of flexibility and an incredible reliability. Now, it's not perfect. There are some quirks here and there. And I want to start this conversation from the things that this camera can't do, because that is the big elephant in the room. This is what created the vast majority of hatred towards this camera when it was launched. As I mentioned in my first impression video, I don't shoot raw video and I don't shoot open gate. So the fact that this camera doesn't have those features that pretty much everyone seems to be asking, although I question how many of those asking for it are actually using them, but that's a different story. Well, those features missing don't affect my workflow at all. Should a camera in this price range have those features? Yes, especially because all the competitors are starting to add those, and so this camera feels like it's been left behind from that standpoint. But you also need to ask yourself, do you really need it, or it's just in case? With that out of the way, let's just focus on what really matters. Still's image quality with the Sony A7V is just spectacular. The sensor, the brand new stock sensor, provides you with a lot of flexibility, a lot of dynamic range. The files are very malleable. I ended up being able to recover highlights way more than I would have expected, to the point where I'm slightly changing the way I expose shots. I was, like everyone, used to think that you gotta preserve highlights no matter what, because it's more difficult to retain highlights when you go into the processing compared to raising your shadows. Well, this camera is capable of great flexibility even in the highlights. Now, of course, it's not gonna save you if you are 5 stops overexposed. That is not the case. But if you're in a range of normal, like, okay, I messed up, but it's 1.5 stops, you can recover that. And that gets you great flexibility, because a shot that is not purposefully underexposed to preserve the highlights, when you show that to your client, when you show the screen of the camera to your client, let's just say you're having a client, it's a way different feeling to see actually a shot that is pleasing to see because the main subject is well exposed, While on the other hand, if you're showing an underexposed shot because you know you're going to recover the shadows afterwards, you're showing to your client something that is clearly needs post-processing. And yes, clients may be used to that, so they may not care too much, but the feeling is not the same. When it comes to using this camera in a professional scenario, that's where this camera shines. The autofocus is super reliable. I've been shooting a lot, and the autofocus is reliable. It tracks really, really well. Of course, when you're shooting thousands of pictures, you are going to have misses here and there, but for the vast majority of my shooting situation, the autofocus has been pretty spectacular. There's an asterisk to that, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about wildlife photography, but in the vast majority of shooting scenario, it's a super reliable and impressive autofocusing system, even with third-party lenses, which sometimes it's not necessarily true for all the cameras or all the brands. And so this means that in general, during these months, I've put this camera through its paces, and the best compliment I can make is this camera has never gotten in the way. And when it comes to professional tools, because the A7V is a professional tool, this is the best compliment you can make. A professional tool is supposed to be something that doesn't get in the way, but actually facilitates what you're trying to achieve with your photography, videography, or whatever that is. And this means the A7V is a pretty dependable tool. It's a tool that gets you great image quality, great performance, and basically little to no compromise. And speaking of compromises, as photographers, as videographers, we would always want to have the perfect natural light. We would not want to use anything else than the available light, and we would always want that light to be perfect. The reality of the fact is, it's never like that. It's almost never like that. And that's where today's sponsor comes to help. K&F with their PL-60B 60 watt COB light give us a pretty small, portable, accessible tool that it doesn't cost a lot of money because it's sold at $129 that helps you light your scene in a pretty easy way without spending much and without carrying a lot of weight with you. It's a very compact, portable, continuous light source ranging between 2700 Kelvin and 6500 Kelvin with great color accuracy of 97 plus CRI, which is provided with an internal battery that lasts up to 45 minutes at a maximum power, and it's sold with a bag, a reflector, and a stand adapter to be ready to use from the get-go. It is compatible with mini Bowens mount accessories, so you need an adapter if you want to use your regular Bowens mount gear, and in general, being lightweight and being portable makes it really easy to use in every scenario, especially a run and gun scenario. The battery is internal. You can charge it via USB-C through a power delivery port on the back or through a AC-DC adapter. The controls layout is fairly simple with a good LCD screen, 2 knobs, and a couple of buttons on the back. But even better, you can control it via Bluetooth with their Linklight app that you can download for your phone or tablet or whatever it is. You also have a fan preventing it from overheating, and the fan is fairly silent even when it's used at its maximum power. You also have plenty of lighting effects that may help you in your video production. Just say you're using it as a background tool to illuminate, to give you an idea of something that is happening in the background. You can flick through all these presets that you have. You're seeing them in the screen right now, and you can also modify the power of the light, but also the speed of the effect so that you can adjust the effect to what you really want to achieve. Because some effects are best when they're fast, some effects are best when they're slow. So giving you that flexibility helps you a lot achieving what you want to achieve. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this light is the light that is being used as my rim light here in my studio setup, and it's been illuminating me for a lot of my videos. Now, back to the camera. I want to talk to you about the battery life on the Sony A7V because the battery life on Sony cameras was great when the new battery was launched, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, I don't recall. But as camera became faster, better, more power demanding, the battery life was still good, but it was starting to feel a little bit compromised. With the Sony A7V, this changed a lot because Sony was able to optimize the battery usage to the point where the same battery seemed to be lasting a lot more than it was used to last, for example, on my Sony A7R5. Now that changed again with the Sony A7R6, but we're going to talk about that in another video. The battery lasts long enough that sometimes you forget to charge it. And speaking of extended usage, this camera never overheats. I've been using it for 6 months. I only had one overheating warning, but my camera was set on the standard temperature. It wasn't set on the high temperatures. Once you set it on the high temperatures, I have never ever gotten a overheating warning, let alone the camera turning off because it was too warm. Now, one of the most attractive things about this camera when it was launched was the fact that finally the electronic shutter was usable, and that allowed you to get beyond the 10 frames per second on the mechanical shutter. You could get to 30 frames per second with electronic shutter and with the capability of using the pre-capture function. All that works incredibly well with only one caveat. The buffer size is not that big, and this means that if you shoot in 30 frames per second, you barely get to 2 seconds. It's basically 1 second, 1 second and a half, at least on my CF Express Type A card. So the buffer isn't that big. This is the only limiting factor when it comes to shooting burst, because the autofocus works really well. The pre-capture function is the best implementation you can find in the market because it allows you to fine-tune to your specific needs and determine how long of a pre-capture time you want. That is an incredible nice option that you have because it helps you not overshooting. And so all of that works great with the only caveat of the buffer size. Now, as usual, the good thing with Sony about buffering is that even when it hits the buffer, it never stops. It slows down a lot at times, but it never stops. So you can keep shooting. However, it's not shooting at 30 frames per second. You gotta keep that in mind. And of course, a blackout-free viewfinder, 30 frames per second burst, pre-capture are all functions that works incredibly well when it comes to sports and wildlife. While I don't shoot sport that much, actually never shoot sport, so I can't talk to you about how it works with sports, I can tell you how it works with wildlife. And wildlife was one of the reasons why, in my opinion, this camera was worth being made like this over something like the Sony A7 IV, because the Sony A7 IV could be used for wildlife, but it was fairly limited. When it comes to the A7 V, all the limitations are basically gone. And this camera for wildlife works spectacularly well. It basically has no limitation. The only thing you need to be aware of is while the sensor is spatially stacked, so it's very fast with readout, it's not the fastest. And this means that if you're panning with vertical structures on the background, you are going to see bent line, those skewed line. And that is annoying, especially because it gets amplified with a longer focal length, which is usually what you use when you're doing wildlife or sports. But at the same time, most of the time in wildlife, those are not shots that are gonna be good anyways, because you don't want those vertical stuff in the frame, whether it's a building or a light pole or anything like that. And if you're panning fast with motorsports, I believe, but correct me if I'm wrong, you can get away with shooting 10 frames per second on the mechanical shutter anyway. So that limitation can be worked around. Let's just put it this way. From an autofocusing standpoint, I have one concern, actually one complaint, but for the rest, the autofocus is spectacularly good because once it locks on, it rarely loses its subject. It's basically, it latches on it and it never let it go. And it's an incredibly good feeling to know that your camera is going to be following your subject. However, when it comes to subject detection, when the subject is very small in the frame, that's where this camera struggles. And this is something that I've noticed in all the Sony cameras except the Sony A7R6, but we're going to talk about that in the in-depth review of that camera. This camera, when the subject is small, it just doesn't find it. And this is not a big deal because you're not going to take pictures of a very small bird in a frame. But where that matters is that if the camera was able to find the subject, it would be easier to track it. Well, sometimes it doesn't see the subject, it focuses on the background and it latches on the background, and until you try to manipulate the autofocusing system to actually see the subject when it's coming towards you, you've already missed some of the potential shots because the camera hasn't seen the subject when it was far away. Besides that, however, there is no complaint at all on the autofocusing system, and this is a very specific case. And still talking about wildlife or fast action sports, one thing that I find very useful is that even if this camera doesn't have the C5 button that let's just say the Sony A1 Mark II has or the Sony A9 Mark III have, this camera you can assign a function button to boost the performance of the burst. And so at the flick of a button, you can go from single frame shooting to burst shooting even up to 30 frames per second. So here are my settings when it comes to easily go from slow shooting to fast shooting. As you can tell, as I turn the camera on, I am now in single shooting. And also if you check the mechanical shutter, it's mechanical, okay? So when you shoot, it's like that. Single shot, normal stuff. I set my AF on button to immediately go to the boost function, and the boost function automatically goes in the mechanical shutter, and that's what happens. I also set the auto exposure lock button to also activate pre-capture because you don't always want the pre-capture, and this means you get the most flexibility you can possibly ask. That to me is really important to help minimize the amount of useless shots that you take. Just say you're shooting a still bird. You're going to take one picture, and that picture is going to be good if you wait for the right moment. And you don't need an entire burst of 15, 20 pictures that are gonna all look the same. So you can leave it in single shot, and then when you see that something's happening, you just push one button, and that button gets you access to the boost function, which is getting you whichever frequency you want, 15, 20, 30 frames per second. That is a very important way of optimizing the way you shoot this specific case scenario. So I actually love the way this camera is set up for the flexibility that it gets you. The fact that you can customize every button makes a lot of sense because each one of us has different needs, and those needs get addressed easily when you can customize every button to the function that you need the most. The one thing that annoyed me the most, however, is that even with the sensor being partially stacked, this camera still has bending issues if you're shooting with high ISO, electronic shutter, and artificial lights. Now, don't get me wrong, the demographic that is going to be affected by this specific case is very small, but it's fair to say that this camera could do better when it comes to avoiding the bending. When it comes to video, besides the feature this camera doesn't have, and we already discussed, this is one of the most flexible tools for getting any type of job done. It gets you reliable performance, smooth tracking of subjects, smooth focus transition. Of course, they depend on the lens that you're using, but most of the time, even with third-party lenses, the focus transitions are fairly smooth. It basically never overheats, as already mentioned. The 4K 60 uncropped is a great thing, and even having a 4K 120, even if it's cropped in APS-C, it's a huge addition. And that 4K 120 is a good 4K 120. It's not as good as the 4K 60, but it's a good 4K 120, so it's usable. But besides the sheer specifications, it's the experience of using this camera for video that makes a difference. During these months, I've been using this camera extensively for both YouTube and client work. And this camera gets you all the flexibility that you need, even when it comes to the file, the quality of the files. I was really impressed when I was shooting a client work, and I find myself in a situation where I had 3 different, completely different light color sources in the frame. I was not shooting log because I hate shooting log unless I absolutely have to. And I knew that I could pull the colors the way that I wanted because the file is super flexible. I was able to get to a good final result despite the situation being really, really complicated. The H.265 10 bits files is very malleable. You can work a lot with it. And I didn't even have to use noise reduction because the file is really good, even at high ISO. Of course, if you're shooting 25,000 ISO, it's a different story, but how many times do you use that setting when it comes to video? I never do, and I think most of the people will never do either. The only thing that you can't complain about when it comes to video is the stabilization is good, but it's not as good as some competitors, mainly Panasonic. It's improved, but it hasn't improved by a dramatic margin. It's not a gimbal-like experience like some have said during these months. It's not like that. You gotta be really good at stabilizing, or you need to use a gimbal to help you smooth out all those jitters. Now, that is if you want a perfectly smooth shot. And for the first time, I'm gonna shock you. For the first time on this channel, I'm here to say that I'm also liking the colors that I get, especially for video with this camera. While I still think that for pictures, Nikon and Fuji have better color science, when it comes to video, I'm starting to like what I get from Sony better than what I'm getting from other brands. So Sony is going in the right direction. They're making more likable files, which is something that I like a lot. One of the things that I forgot, and it's one of the things that I hate the most in every Sony camera, is that whenever you're shooting video, let's just say you are in a 25p settings, 2550 or 100p settings, okay? And you want to switch to 24 or 30 or 60 or 120. What you need to do, you can't just go and change your frame rate. You need to go into the area mode, function, the menu function that goes to the area date, then go to the NTSC PAL selector, you hit enter, the camera basically resets, it starts all over again, and then you see it's not fast doing that, then you can go change your video settings to the setting that you need the most. That to me is super stupid. And so if you're looking at the full package, if you're looking at what this camera can and cannot do, this is definitely the most compelling camera under $3,000 that you can purchase in 2026 if you're looking for a hybrid camera, because it gets you great reliability, great flexibility, great files, great workability of those files, and it gets you access to the most complete lenses lineup as of 2026. So it's really hard to find a reason not to recommend a camera like the A7V. It's basically everything you can possibly ask, unless you want open gate or internal RAW. Now, this video has been very long, and if you made it this far, I want to thank you a lot. I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already, and I want to ask you to leave me a thumbs up because it helps the algorithm to make my channel more visible to others, but also activate your notification bell, because In the near future, I'm going to release a video that compares the Sony A7V, A7R5, and the brand new A7R6 to help you determine which one is the best camera for you. Because the answer is not that easy. There's a lot of things that need to be discussed, but that's for another video. So don't forget to subscribe and activate the notification bell because this video is coming up really, really, really soon. Now, I want to know what you think. Let me know in the comments below. I just want to help you find answers. If I haven't, for whatever reason, giving you the answer that you wanted, let me know. I'll try to get those answers to you. I try to answer to all of your comments. And I guess that's it for today. Ciao, grazie, and I'll see you in the next one.